So we're now going to move on to our next speaker. Jono Nicholas is the CEO of Reach Out. They are an internet mental health provider in Australia, the mental health provider in Australia. And I've met Jono at a conference earlier this year, listened to his speech, and I wanted to invite him to this conference to share some of his insights about disruption, about mental health, and about the way in which technology can make a difference. Jono.
Thank you, Paul, for the introduction, and thank you all for coming this morning, particularly after a big night for, I assume, some of you. By way of background, Reach Out is a digital mental health organisation that was actually the first digital mental health service in the world. We launched 20 years ago in Australia, and I was fortunate enough to be part of the founding team. My personal history is I lost a friend to suicide when I was 14 and made a personal decision at that point to work in the area of mental health. But the big part and what I want to share with you today is really the lesson that's now coming through mental health that may extend out to a much broader area of your professions around how do we navigate this transition of digital disruption. So let's reach out. For those that are interested, you can jump into au.reachout.com, you'll see the Australian platform. As you can see there, we operate in Australia, Ireland, and the US, each offering slightly different platforms. And the real focus and what you heard there from our patron Ian Thorpe is how do we provide scalable mental health in a country where very, very few people can access any mental health services at all. And I think I'd certainly endorse the previous speaker's message that we often present this as a choice between getting digital help or what would be called in Australia real help. And really what we're often talking about in mental health care is the choice between struggling by yourself at 2 o'clock in the morning in your own room or getting some help. What we now know is it's the preferred source of help for young people when they're going through mental health distress. And in fact, the data in Australia shows that when a young person's experiencing a mental health difficulty, they do one of three things. They turn to the internet, they talk to their friends, or they talk to their parents. And so really the incentive and what we've been working on is how can you use digital strategies, digital tools to provide very, very scalable self-help as the first line of defence when those young people are going through a tough time, but also then give them the knowledge, confidence and skills to navigate to all the other services that exist in the community. So because we've worked in this space for 20 years, I've started really trying to understand what is about technology and how, as a technology-based organisation, can we continue to adapt and evolve, and why is it, in effect, that the health sector and the mental health sector has had an evolutionary path in relation to technology rather than a disruptive path. And by that I mean is that while we've seen some changes, and I think you heard some great changes there from our previous speaker, it hasn't fundamentally transformed what's going on in our service models. But my view, and if you look around the world, the disruption is coming, and I think the question that I've got for you being here in the UK, how do you know when that disruption's there? Because the history of disruption is that everyone believes that it's a few years away up until it's at your door. I think that story of Blockbuster is a great one around Netflix. I'm fairly sure there were a lot of board meetings being had saying Netflix was just a postal video service, it can never compete with us. So disruption always feels a few years away up until it's at your door, and once it's at your door, then you are definitely chasing it. And the only way in which you can kind of deal with this is to assume that it's going to happen a lot earlier than it will happen. And start making kind of plans and preparations. I would argue, if I was in your position, I wouldn't be making plans for 2025, I'd be making a lot of plans for transformation to 2019 and 2020. And if you slip it by a year, you're still a few years ahead. But if you miss that 2025 deadline, then chances are you've not only been beaten by the deadline, you've been beaten by some very, very well-funded competitors who are coming in around the side. So what then are, for the social sector, what would be some of the signs that disruption was coming? Well, the first thing is disruption tends to happen in industries where there's a lot of money. And I think we can all agree in health and in the social care area globally, this is an area with a lot of capital, with a lot of need to spend, both from governments and, as we've heard, from private individuals. When you look at mental health, it's currently about a $2 trillion global spend, due to rise to $6 trillion. It will grow as a major area of investment as you see some of the developing economies like India, Indonesia, and particularly China move from a physical labour-based economy to an intellectual economy. Therefore, they're going to value what's between people's ears at a scale that we can't imagine. So there's lots of money out there. That means that the big boys will start circling. There's a large affected population. Mental health affects at any given time around 1 in 4 people and 1 in 2 people across their lives. And therefore, it's something that's amenable to disruption on a large scale rather than something that might happen within a particular community. There has to be some level of dissatisfaction with the current service provision. And one of the things I get some great advice from people at Google, and what they focus on in terms of developing new products is what they call the irritation, the sense that things just aren't working well now. And in fact, it's the best way that they look to protect the Google search engine, because they say actually the switch cost from a Google search engine to a Bing is zero. It's just a change in the URL. The bit that they focus on is how can we make everyone who uses our Google search so satisfied that they don't want to switch. I have been around the world and I have never come across a mental health system where everyone says this is a world-class system. In fact, it's by and large described by both government, providers and the community as dysfunctional. And there's a sense of very, very high irritation even while people are getting services. What does that mean? It means that if someone comes along and offers you a slightly different and better opportunity, then the switch cost is actually very, very low. You're willing to move and you're willing to move en masse. In Australia, that was certainly the case with taxi drivers and Ubers. It wasn't that Ubers were particularly better. It was if you spoke to most people in Sydney, they were dissatisfied with the taxi industry. So therefore, it wasn't only a new opportunity that comes along, but a sense of dissatisfaction with the existing providers. The question for me in terms of your work that you do is, do you speak enough to your consumers? Do you co-design your work with your consumers so that even if there was an alternative opportunity, they would choose not to go? How do you reduce dissatisfaction to protect yourself? That it's a provider-controlled system. I think that would certainly be my experience being here in the UK, is that the community does not feel in control of their care. They do not feel all the time that people listen to them, and that often they are being given the services that people feel are good for them rather than the services that they want. Again, that tends to create some very fertile ground for disruption. That it's highly inefficient. Therefore, there's opportunities for scale. And again, if I look in mental health care, but it certainly extends across social services care, the level of inefficiency is actually phenomenal. In fact, recently in Australia, I went for I had to have some very minor surgery. It took me 4 useless conversations with various medical professionals before I could get the thing that I'd already chosen that I'd actually wanted. Each of those was designed to be a checkup point, but no one asked me whether I actually wanted a checkup point, but those checkup points were mandatory. So it cost the system a lot, cost me a lot of time and money, and showed the level of inefficiency built around a particular system that wasn't necessarily built around my needs as a consumer. And finally, that it's government protected. And you see in a lot of areas where disruption happens very, very quickly, and the reason why there's this sense of do nothing and then the world changes pretty quickly is because you've lived in a very protected economic environment. In healthcare, there are only services that can be provided or rebated through government. There are particular providers who are unable to come. There are particular restrictions that happen there. What we're seeing in disruption is a lot of those rules are starting to be broken down. And what I would argue is that at least in mental health, and I suspect in a number of other areas, the disruption's already here. It's just in its nascent areas. And the reason why I am particularly convinced that it'll happen at a large scale the next 2 to 3 years is not because of the quality of ideas that are coming out, but simply about the amount of capital that is currently being moved by the big boys. So if you look at it as 3 examples on the
right there, you'll see recently Google put a depression assessment test directly into the search results in their US search engine. They didn't consult anyone as far as I could tell. I certainly spoke with the Google people in Australia and they knew nothing about it. But essentially what it showed was that Google moved from simply being a referral point to other agencies to essentially offering a service within Google Search, an assessment service. It is not then too much to assume that they will start preferencing the services that you get off the back of that. They'll then start providing the services, and you see the cascading effect where Google within probably about 12 to 18 months could move from being a non-player in the mental health landscape to being a central player. All because it controls the first point of access. And once you control the first point of access, you can control a lot in how that system goes. They launched a company called Verily under the Alphabet, which is essentially their life sciences division in 2015, got the director of the National Institute of Mental Health to become one of their founding staff members, a guy called Tom Insel. Shows you the seriousness with which they're playing. He has now spun off from Google to start a company called Mindstrong that's looking at mobile-based clinical assessments. So again, part of this is the challenge of disruption is that we accept the rules of how you get assessment, who can provide assessment, where they can provide assessment, and what you're finding coming out of Silicon Valley in particular now is the coming together of knowledge, a huge investment in technology enabling some things that previously weren't possible, and capital, so that they can do some things at scale. And then the final example, just to give you an idea around how quickly some of these things are moving, some of you may use or be aware of the Headspace mindfulness app. What you may not be aware of is it recently had a $40 million capital raising round and was recently valued at $250 million. So if you think of that as an investment point, that is a service that is being offered globally for many people in the community. They are being recommended mindfulness or meditation as part of their therapeutic interventions. It's not an intervention that requires any permission from any government or any service provider here in the UK and doesn't necessarily need any funding or support here in the UK, but it could very quickly become one of the biggest mental health providers here in the UK. Because once you have a payment app, once you have one intervention, it's not too hard to add on new and more interventions off the back of it, right? So again, if you look at the story of Uber, they started as a company for black cars, for limousines in San Francisco, and kept adding adjacencies to their market until they were a behemoth, right? So one of the things that I think is really critical here is the marginal players at the moment have the potential in 2 to 3 years in a disrupted environment to become very, very significant global players. So when Paul said to you yesterday that you have a burning platform, I'd absolutely agree. The question and the concern that I have is, how do we adapt to this? How do we, as people who are interested in civil society, who are deeply interested, in your case in the UK and in my case, deeply interested in Australia, believe that there are some things that are of benefit by being created out of civil society? How do we compete with these sorts of movements going on? What will be the challenges that happen through this? The first thing, and I've already talked a little bit about it, is that what you'll see is a very, very strong move from local delivery to globalised delivery. If there's one thing that digital does better than anything else is that it moves IP, it moves services quickly around the world from a central point. So one of the challenges that this means in terms of healthcare is most healthcare is thought of as local healthcare. In fact, just being at the conference, being a guest at your conference, I was fascinated, and I commented to a few people of how inward-facing the conversations were. There were conversations about the regulator here in the UK, there were conversations about purchasing agencies, local NGOs, what's happening in my community or in my city. What you find with these companies is that they are not inward-facing, they are outward-facing. They're not asking what are the opportunities here in Birmingham, they're asking what are the opportunities in India or China. What are the opportunities in the hundreds of millions, not the opportunities in the thousands. So there's a fundamentally different mindset when you go to global delivery. The second thing is, and I think for those of you who are working as purchasers or working in the funding environment, is that profit is the major motive. And so what we're already starting to see in mental health is that these big global plays are picking off the low-hanging fruit, the places of really high margin. So in mental health, what does that mean? It means depression, anxiety, and interventions like meditation. What will that mean? It means that the purchasing authorities and governments will largely be left with the burden of decreasing access to your services while also dealing and working in the most complex parts of the system. So one of the challenges with a profit as a major motive in this model is not that they provide low quality care. In fact, many of the initiatives that are coming through these digital disruptions are actually awesome. They're awesome services that do all the things that I've heard at this conference you want. They're co-designed with the consumers. They're very engaging. They do all the things that you want. So they're good services. It's not about that. It's but by profit being the major motive, they are not interested in building civil society here in the UK. They're not interested in the complexity and the differences between Birmingham and London and Scotland and elsewhere. They're interested in a global play that's highly efficient and therefore leaving you to other things. And thirdly, for those of you who work in government, and this has been my message to governments around the world, what you see in disruption is government moves from a central player to a marginalised player. And so the focus then moves to what role does government play? Do we need government to even play a particular role? And Uber is a great example of this. Uber was actually set up as an illegal company. Its deliberate and stated intent was to enter a market knowing that the laws prevented it from operating in that market and move so quickly and so hard to get such scale and such consumer satisfaction that it forced the laws to change. Right? So governments, rather than controlling access to the providers, actually within 6 months became marginalised by an illegal operation. So one of those challenges that we've got is you will have a dynamic that operates between government and service providers and the consumers that are essentially a level of codependent relationships. I think if they were therapeutic, they'd be designed to be dysfunctional. What you find with these players is they don't necessarily care. They see government as a thing to be managed and a thing to be avoided, whether that be in taxation or elsewhere. So one of the central tenets of your industry then become, well, what happens? How do we move if we're doing all this complex negotiations and service provisions and contract negotiations and all the things that we do with government, while someone else is necessarily operating on an uneven playing field with capital that you can't access, moving at a speed that you can't access. And so they're the real challenges, the real reason why I would say if I was in your area, I wouldn't be looking at a 2025 deadline. Keep in mind that less than 10 years ago, Apple launched the iPhone. I'd be looking at what's the 3-year horizon? What would we need to do to move at pace in this sector here in the UK? How would we think like a digital company to adapt and provide better services, not only for our own survival, but as we heard in the last series of stories, because the people we serve will have a better life. And they'll have a better life not in 5 years and 7 years and 9 years, but they'll have a better life in 12 months. What is it that we would need to do to move at speed? So the 3 things that I would recommend. The first is think global, not local. What is it that you can do to have an outward orientation? How do you move the IP that you have here in the UK that might be of incredible value in a country like Australia that's in the early stages of a national disability insurance scheme? What are the opportunities for sharing IP across civil society as opposed to working intensively to maybe expand one more region or another 1,000 clients or another 100 clients here in the UK, but think about what it would take to scale the business and the opportunities and the cooperation to 100 million or 200 million. What it does is it fundamentally changes the mindset of your organisation when you think globally. And it's not all about becoming a big player yourself, becoming a big multinational. In fact, a number of the conversations I've been having here in the UK is what is it that we could do that would open up IP sharing agreements across civil society in areas like healthcare and social care that would mean a great innovation here in the UK could easily find a market in Australia. The biggest challenge in my experience, to be honest, is government saying, well, it worked elsewhere, so we need to do a trial here in the blah, 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 and it needs to take 12 months and 18 months, and it's just not worthwhile. What is it that would say, actually, an innovation like Reach Out that's operated very well for 20 years in Australia could move at speed and operate here in the UK because it's shown to be safe in Australia. The second thing is, how do you become investment ready? I think one of the big things that I would say is it should be a central conversation within this group is about what are the forms of capital that you can raise. And the most important thing that I would say for those of you in purchasing roles is that you should be moving to a risk-based capital investment approach. What that means is essentially you put a small amount of capital into things that have high risk that may not work but are interesting ideas, and you put large amounts of capital into things that have proven to work but should be operating at scale. The big challenge in our sector is the trial initiative. The initiative where you go, we're going to put some money and get everybody excited, we'll do it here in this city, but when it comes time to scale, the capital isn't there. When it comes time to roll across 5, 10, 15 cities, when it comes time to move from 100,000 budget to $1 million or 2 million or 10 million or 50 million, the capital goes missing. What is it that we would need to do to move that capital off the bench? Because that's the way the tech companies think. And then the final thing is, I think as an industry, understanding what it is that you can do to have an R&D engine, an innovation engine for civil society. What is it that you would need to do to attract capital according to risk, to scale services that are new and promising, and to decommission services quickly that aren't? What is it that we can do in that means that we can compete at a level and at a speed with some of these organisations that I can guarantee will see the sorts of opportunities that operating here in the UK, but won't be particularly interested in the UK. To be honest, they'll be interested in seeing the UK as an interesting example that will then enable them to do a globalised service delivery elsewhere in the world. I think for civil society to compete, we need to have conversations not about what we do, but about how we do it. How do we move capital? How do we develop IP sharing agreements? How do we respond at a level of speed and a level of quality and with a level of money that allows us to do amazing things, to take the knowledge and the expertise that sits here in this room, to do amazing things for the people we serve, and do it in a way that means that we can compete and not, as Paul said, not be disrupted, but be the disruptors. Thank you.